Done their deliberations in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal trial. After weeks of testimony and evidence, the case is now in their hands. Will they find him guilty or not guilty of the federal sex crimes charges? Will they be hung? Tell you what, we're going to dive into what happened today, including a question from the jury that shocked us all. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. We are now officially in verdict watch in the Sean Diddy Combs criminal case. Jurors were sent back to deliberate today. They had a interesting series of notes from the jurors, too, which we're going to talk about. And we also heard the jury instructions, which let me tell you right now, so complicated, okay? So complex. I wonder if the jury is going to just have difficulty with them. I wouldn't be surprised. I really wouldn't be surprised. And remember what's at stake here: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking, transportation to engage in prostitution. These are not simple charges to digest or apply to all of the evidence in this case. But remember, Sean Combs, if found guilty, he could face decades or even life in prison if he's convicted of all of these charges. So we want to talk about what happened today in court. And let me bring on Law&Crime's in-court reporter, Elizabeth Millner, fan favorite. Elizabeth, great to see you. Thanks so much for taking the time. So first up, where are we in the deliberations process? How long have they been going before they requested to go home at 5 p.m. Eastern?
Well, they've been going for quite a while, Jesse. So far, a little close to 5 hours of deliberation. So they're getting pretty in there, and that's only been on day one. Obviously, they came back with a note that says that they are ready to leave at 5 p.m. today. So unfortunately, they didn't go past 5 o'clock or anything like that. They're not still continuing on with their deliberations, but they will start bright and early again tomorrow morning. But it's interesting, Jesse, because already they've having some pretty interesting questions for the judge as to what their jury instructions and their the jury charges.
Let's talk about that. There were, I think, 3 notes. There was 1 note and then there was 2 notes at the end. Let's start with the first note. Happened shortly after they went back to deliberate. What was that note about?
Yeah, well, the first note right off the top was a simple note, or at least I think it was a simple note. It was that the jury had decided who their foreperson is going to be, and that was juror number 5. Now, a lot of us had a couple questions in terms of if it's juror number 5 going back to voir dire and that juror number that was assigned to them then, or does it have to correlate with their seat numbers? But I think we kind of all figured it out. It was kind of going back to the voir dire process. So what we know about juror number 5 is, who again is the foreperson, he's a religious man. He is an investment analyst. He's a Connecticut Country Club member, and so he's going to be the one taking charge. And I think once the jury comes to their decision, he'll be reading that note out loud in front of the court, in front of a lot of people who are anticipating that verdict too.
Oh, yeah, that's right. And then we got the controversial note, the big note everybody was talking about, again, relatively early on in the deliberation process.
Yeah, pretty early on. It came about 1:30 p.m. That's when the judge had read the note out loud. I think the actual message of the note came back probably maybe 20 or so minutes, or close to an hour beforehand, actually, that it had to kind of pertain to juror number 25. And so this particular note was that juror number 25 can't follow instructions, and those instructions being the judge's instructions. And so initially the court was proposing to write back, okay, please explain the nature of your concern. Is it a lack of understanding? Is it unwillingness to follow the instructions? But even as it pertains to juror number 25, what we do know about this particular juror, he's 51 years old, he's a man, and he is a scientist. Again,
I ain't know jurors have to follow instructions. I thought, they make their decision based off their own,
going back to voir dire, learning a little bit about these jurors and knowing a little bit about their background. So that's what we've learned of him. So initially the defense was like, okay, we're a little hesitant to lay out just all the different possibilities. Just ask them to kind of work through everything. They're still early in their deliberations. They still have a lot of time to consider. So that was the defense's initial and proposed instruction, whereas the government was like, okay, I think we should be a little more specific. They wanted to review some of the cases or the case laws too. And so their proposal was, I received your note. I remind every juror to remember my instructions. Please make sure that the note doesn't reveal which way the juror is leaning. So then they kind of took a little bit of time, worked out their issues, couldn't come back to a decision at the end of it. So the judge ended up kind of making his own decision in terms of the proposed note to go back to the juror. And it was pretty much a neutral way that kind of, I think, appeased maybe both parties, or maybe not so much the defense as it did the government, but it was a way to kind of neutralize everything. And then for a while, Jesse, we didn't have a note for a few hours. And so then towards the end of the day, we got that one of the final notes from the jury.
Hey, so I know you guys might be into true crime, but little side note, anybody out there also in a business of some kind? If so, let me tell you real quick about Odoo, our sponsor. Why? Odoo is a powerful all-in-one business software that helps you manage everything from sales to accounting and, yes, inventory. Their inventory dashboard makes it easy to track receipts, delivery orders, POS orders, and see what's waiting, late, or back ordered all at a glance. You can pay for receipts, automate vendor reminders, and schedule deliveries all in just a few clicks. Plus, you get full warehouse. And this juror is an issue, or there's another juror that's an issue, or there's a juror gets sick or something like this, or has a conflict, they do have jurors on standby, right?
They do have jurors on standby. However, they're not in the deliberation room when the jury and the main jury, that being the first 12 that were assigned to this particular jury. So the alternates were able to go home if there was ever a situation where an alternate needed to be called in to kind of be tagged out with one of the other jurors. And again, we haven't gotten there yet. So all the alternates are not in the main jury room at all. They're not even in the courthouse. They went back home. However, they gave jury staff members their contact information, which included their phone number. So if there is a situation that arises where an alternate needs to be called in, they're able to get a hold of them just by the court staff getting a hold of their contact information that they gave to them before they were eventually dismissed.
Now, the final note, or the final two notes. One was we want to go, home at 5 p.m. They were allowed to stay longer if they wanted to, that they wanted to go home. But we finally got a substantive note in terms of the actual charges. And talk to us about what that note was about. They had a very specific question regarding an actual charge.
Yeah, they had a very specified question to your point, Jesse, and it had to do with what was on page 37 of the jury charge, and that was the jury instructions. And so the note read, referring to page 37, if a person wants, requests, or asks for controlled substances, has the individual distributed? And I think that was a pretty interesting note, given that one of the counts, especially one of the predicate acts, is drug distribution. And so I think maybe the jury was kind of confused possibly on the language of the law that was written, or maybe they just wanted just some more clarification as it particularly pertained to drug distribution under count one, under the RICO conspiracy. And so what ended up happening is that, yes, to your point, Jesse, the jury was dismissed at 5 p.m. today. They were able to go home for the end of the day, because I know a lot of people have been asking whether or not this jury has been sequestered. They are not sequestered. They are free to go home at the end of the day. They're just not allowed to discuss the case. They're not allowed to watch any documentaries, movies. They cannot watch this sidebar episode. So if any juror is watching the sidebar episode, no, that cannot be a thing. But what ended up happening is, after the jury was dismissed, the court had come up with a suggestion to answer their question. And the initial suggestion by the court, so by the judge, was to refer to page 37, lines 1 through 3 of the jury charge. However, he said that both sides can kind of wait until tomorrow to give their.
They need somebody credible to verify, like, you know what I'm saying? He was giving people drugs if they asked for it. So make it look bad and worse,
Proposed kind of note back to the jury. So what the government's response was, though, is that they were kind of concerned about that specific instruction, and they wanted this particular note back to the jury to go that yes, they wanted literally the words yes to be written in the note back, and they say yes, but also give that proposed instruction about referring back to page 37, specifically lines 1 through 3. However, obviously the defense was going to have issue to it, because if you're thinking about, a note going back and it's saying yes, this person is distributing, obviously that's not going to look too good for the defense. So the defense kind of were just like, okay, wait, let's have a little more time to kind of think things through, talk things out with, my colleagues, as well as confer with the government about things. And so what they're going to do, Jesse, is they're going to confer until about 6 p.m. today. Then they're going to probably write it in a form of like a letter to the judge or an email, that type of sort.
Because so they can have some leverage to press Diddy. They're going to, try to press him, see who he getting it from.
Give it back to the judge, and then they'll discuss it further bright and early tomorrow morning when court begins at 9 a.m.
And that's interesting. The drug distribution part of racketeering conspiracy, arguably maybe one of the stronger underlying predicate crimes to get to racketeering conspiracy. Let's talk about this, because I have to say, jury instructions are usually a snore. They're usually really, really boring in a case, particularly when you have a straightforward charge of, let's say, like a murder charge, right? This case, these jury instructions, 62 pages, are so important. They are so specific. They are so complex. These are not easy to understand charges. So I think I wonder if it's going to take the jury some time just to go over them and understand what they're assigned to be doing, what the elements are. So I want to go over some of the jury instructions that were read aloud today in court. their application to the case. Again, really important because this is the law that the jury will use to guide them.
Yeah, that's what I want to hear.
Not going to go through it all, but here are some highlights that I took out. So aside from the basic instructions on, role of the court and the jury, the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, circumstantial evidence versus direct evidence, they got into the elements of the charges, and the government has to prove each of these beyond a reasonable doubt. So first of all, when we talk about racketeering conspiracy, arguably the most complex charge, it says, quote, first, that in or about 2004 through in or about 2024, so 20 years, there was an agreement among two or more persons to conduct or participate in the affairs of an enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. Elizabeth, how do you think the prosecution did to try to prove, hey, everyone, Sean Combs, his assistants, his bodyguards, his inner circle, they all agreed to this? How do you think they did about that?
So they can, they got to make it as a group. It got to be a group to have that racketeering charge. It got to be,
You heard in this case so far.
Yeah, well, I think that was the big thing.
They can't charge it with racketeering by itself. Got to be organization.
Right, this whole
organization,
criminal enterprise, and according to the government and according to the allegations made by the government, that Sean Combs was at the head of this alleged criminal enterprise. So throughout this trial, what have we learned about the alleged co-conspirators? That being Christina Quorum, that being security guards like D-Rock and Fahim, but also what we've learned too is what the government calls his foot soldiers, and that being the assistants. The assistants kind of in a way doing Sean Combs' bidding, whether it is procuring drugs, whether it be a small amount for personal use, as the defense might say, or whether it be drug supplies that were also used in these freak-offs, because according to the government, drugs were an essential ingredient for these freak-offs, or hotel nights, wild debauchery nights, whatever you want to call them. And so I think in terms of just showing, I know a lot of us were kind of like, oh, more text messages, more text, more audio messages, all of that stuff, but really kind of hearing how the assistants would communicate not only with Sean Combs, but also, again, his alleged co-conspirator, that being Christina Quorum, whether it's to get reimbursement for drugs or get reimbursement for personal supplies that the assistants would use to pay for with their own money, get reimbursement through the company, and things of that sort. And so in terms of just count one, and that being the racketeering conspiracy, I think the government made a pretty strong case. Now, whether or not the jury agrees, that is kind of the question going forward now.
And that's just one element, right? So that was just one element. Was there an agreement? Okay. The second element was that the racketeering enterprise or its activities would have affected, or in fact affected, interstate or foreign commerce. And on that point, it says interstate or foreign commerce simply means the movement of goods, services, money, and individuals between any two or more states, or between one state and the District of Columbia, or between a state and a U.S. territory or possession, or between the United States and a foreign country. All narcotics activity, even purely local narcotics activity, has an effect on interstate commerce. Now, Elizabeth, I guess that's all about transporting Jane and Cassie Ventura Fine for alleged sex trafficking and prostitution and drug offenses, right? That's the big theme there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was something that, again, I think a lot of people are like, okay, it's sex trafficking as counts 2 and 4, but it also kind of falls in.
They add all those extra charges that really have something to do with each other. So they, at the end, they can charge you with something when they throw a few out.
Under RICO a little bit too, because in terms of just interstate or foreign commerce that was affected, according to the government, the defendant knowingly recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, or maintained the victim. The defendant knew or recklessly disregarded that threats of force, fraud, or coercion, or any of the combination of force, fraud, or coercion would be used to cause the victim to engage in commercial sex acts. And again, pointing back to interstate or foreign commerce were affected, because if you think about just going to one of the summary charts or one of the summary exhibits where you're seeing flight records where Jane or Cassie Ventura, even back when Cassie was in a relationship with Sean Combs, Jane was in a relationship with Sean Combs, what you could see from those flight records is flights traveling either from Los Angeles to Miami, or from Los Angeles to New York City, or vice versa. Some even in instances traveling to Turks and Caicos, as Jane had recalled during her testimony. And so in terms of just interstate or foreign commerce, again, the government kind of pointing to that these fall under the elements of sex trafficking, whether it's sex trafficking under RICO, or it also kind of pertains to counts 2 and 4, that being sex trafficking to Cassie and sex trafficking to Jane too.
And yeah, that's an important element as well as, and I think this is the one I want to explore with you too. So third is the defendant knowingly and willfully joined that agreement. And fourth is that the defendant knowingly and willfully agreed that he or another member of the conspiracy would commit two racketeering acts. This is what we talk about, the underlying predicate crimes, right? And that's where it lists out kidnapping, arson, bribery, tampering with a witness, victim, or informant, forced labor, sex trafficking, transportation and inducement to travel for purposes of prostitution and other illegal sexual activities, possession with intent to distribute, or distribution of narcotics and controlled substances. And there are theories for each one of these, like kidnapping or aiding and abetting kidnapping. By the way, there are detailed descriptions of each underlying crime too. There is so much for this jury to process. Again, I can't emphasize that enough. Massive undertaking for this jury. So much law to consider. Now, Elizabeth, out of those underlying crimes, okay, and they need to find that there was a conspiracy to commit two of them, right? Which do you feel would be the easier to prove? Which stood out to you from the prosecution's case? And which maybe are you like, I don't know? Because let me tell you, on the verdict form, they have to list out which ones were proven, which ones they were unanimously proven.
Yeah, well, I think the ones that stood out to me, I've already talked about drug distribution. I've already talked about kidnapping, but I'm just going to kind of add two more to that list too. And I'm going to talk about arson and bribery. So for example, arson pertaining to what had happened in January of 2012, because I remember when the government was giving their closing argument, they listed out all the participants of what had happened with Kid Cudi's car in the Porsche. And that included D-Rock, who set up the meeting between Sean Combs and Kid Cudi after the fact. That included Rue, who allegedly went over there with Capricorn Park and Sean Combs over to Kid Cudi's home. And so, the jury was able to see photos of Kid Cudi's burnt car. We've been able to see these photos too.
If he didn't, people do that relationships. People get in relationships, have relationship problems, and they do this all the time. Fight with boyfriends, fight, you know what I'm saying? So
release them. And so everybody has been able to see them at this point. And so while there's this kind of lingering question on whether or not the defendant may have had involvement in this, according to the government, they say, of course, the defendant was behind this 100%. The government is sure that Sean Combs is behind this Molotov cocktail, whether or not he was the one who, now there's always been a kind of a conversation on whether or not he was the one.
So what do that show?
But according to the...
What do that show? Do that show that he was a pimp, or do that show that Diddy just was somebody that was in love? He was in love,
Defense, there was partial female DNA that was found on the bottle, but according to just some of the other pieces of evidence that the government was able to show the jury, including, messages from Cassie Ventura.
This man is a billionaire. I don't think he got to be a pimp.
Where she had alleged that Sean Combs was planning to blow up Kid Cudi's car, and it wouldn't be at his hands. He'd be out of the country when this was going on. And so, according to the government, the evidence suggested that Sean Combs had something to do with this Molotov cocktail that was lodged into Kid Cudi's car back in 2012. I think another interesting one too, Jesse, is bribery as one of the predicate acts that I might think could be easy-ish to prove, or that the government has already kind of proved it, and that has to deal with what had happened in Los Angeles, California in March of 2016 at the Intercontinental Hotel over there, where Sean Combs had paid $100,000 for that surveillance tape. Now, while the defense says it was because of a PR standpoint, that Cassie and both Sean Combs didn't want to look bad or anything like that, it was nothing nefarious. It was nothing about preventing a witness from going to law enforcement or bringing this information to police or anything like that. They say it was all about PR, and they just don't want each other to look bad. But I think when you talk about just the text messages that accompanied what had happened around this time frame, where Christina Quorum is messaging one of the assistants saying, just say that they had a drunken night and try to get the tape, those types of things that she was sending to the assistants. I think it also kind of might have to go into possibly the conspiracy too, where there was this really kind of active measure to really make sure that they got a hold of this particular surveillance video by any means necessary.
You've highlighted them well. I think those are ones that the jury's going to be wrestling with. And obviously, as we talked about, they had a question about drug distribution. So that's one of the ones they might be considering. By the way, one of the things that I can't ignore, and I don't know if people are talking about it enough, is, if he's convicted, what's his sentence going to be, right? So one of the things the jurors will be asked to decide, it's actually on the verdict form, is if they find Diddy guilty of racketeering, the other question they have to ask is, has the government also proven sex trafficking of Cassie and Jane was within the scope of the pattern of racketeering activity. And if so, there is a special sentencing factor. That's what it is. That means potentially more prison time.
That's so fun. Coolest plugin I ever used. Arcade.
That is a larger range of prison time. So it's very significant, the Cassie and Jane alleged sex trafficking. So now let's talk about sex trafficking of Cassie.
Most likely, if Diddy go home, they're going to take the big charges off. They're going to slap him with all those little charges. He's going to have about 20 years on paper.
And Jane, you mentioned it before about knowingly recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provide, obtained, or maintained a person by any means. By the way, the judge actually said in the instructions, I instruct you to use the ordinary.
And it already showed that he's a drug addict. So they're going to, have him 20 years on paper, drop in and all that type of stuff,
Everyday definitions of those terms. Recruit means to seek to enroll. Entice means to attract, induce, or lure. Harbor means to provide shelter, such as in a house or other place. Transport means to take or convey from one place to another. Provide means to furnish, supply, or make available. Obtain means to gain possession of or acquire. Maintain means to keep in an existing state or support. Second, that the defendant knew or recklessly disregarded the fact that force, threats of force, fraud, or coercion, or any combination of such means would be used to cause the alleged victim to engage in a commercial sex act. And that's interesting, too. It defines a commercial sex act in the instructions as any sex act on account of which anything of value is given to or received by any person. A thing of value need not involve a monetary exchange and need not have any financial component. The defendant need not be the person who receives the thing of value from the sex act. Also note that it is not required that the alleged victim actually performed a commercial sex act as long as the government has proved that the defendant recruited, enticed, harbored, transported, provided, obtained, or maintained the alleged victim for purposes of engaging in a commercial sex act. And that last part goes to the allegation that Combs beat Cassie at the Intercontinental Hotel hallway in 2016 as she was leaving a room with a male performer, but there wasn't a completed sex act. Or the government would be arguing that is still sex trafficking. And
if you see when that video first came out, people didn't see it. It's a video where it shows Cassie come down the hallway, then Diddy come down the hallway. His hands is totally empty. When he threw her on the floor, he walked back to the room. Cassie had his phone. Cassie was still in his phone. So it had to be some relationship problem where she saw some in his phone. So I said, she already, like, they participate and do this and that, right? So I feel like if she saw something in his phone, what she saw was somebody she know, a friend, because like she already know he a billionaire, he got plenty of girls. Only thing that probably would have hurt her is him messing with her, one of her friends or something. You know what I'm saying?
The third element, that the defendant's conduct was affecting interstate or foreign commerce. But Elizabeth, this is what I wanted to ask you. Force, the force component, that's easy to prove. That's easy to understand, at least. Did he use violence to force them to, get them to do sex trafficking acts, right? Sex acts, freak offs, wild king nights, those kind of things, hotel nights. What in the government's case stood out to you as a form of fraud or coercion to induce Cassie or Jane into sex trafficking? That's not so easily understood. Can you explain, in your opinion, from this case, what are they talking about with fraud or coercion with Cassie or Jane?
Yeah, well, I'll take the first one as it pertains to fraud first, only because, that to me was something that kind of puzzled in my head too a little bit, Jesse, until there were some arguments that happened outside the presence of the jury. I think this was even before Jane had testified, where the prosecution was like, we plan on proving sex trafficking by fraud. Why? Because they believe that, Diddy enticing.
And as far as the sex trafficking thing, they got text messages of Cassie saying, I'm always down for a freak off. You know what I'm saying? Like, that ain't sex trafficking.
Jane to come over to Miami or wherever it be in the hopes that the two would just hang out together. The two would just have a wholesome date night. The two would just be alone together without an escort being present or an entertainer being present. And Jane would fly over there. She would do that. And then what would happen? That an escort or an entertainer would end up coming after Sean Combs had promised that it would just be the two of them hanging out together, being on a date night, those types of things. Even in terms of fraud by, promising her trips and promising her gifts, all of that stuff is something that I think the government was really trying to prove. Now, whether or not that the jury actually kind of believes this argument in a way, I think that will also that's a question that also kind of remains in my head. But in terms of coercion, I think there were a lot of instances that were sprinkled out through witness testimony, especially through Cassie and through Jane, where, for example, Cassie and Jane had both testified that they had to do freak offs or hotel nights while they both had urinary tract infections or UTIs. That Cassie even said that she did freak offs while she was on her menstrual cycle. These are things that kind of under the law are determined as coercion, just things that obviously that they don't want to do, but they are doing these types of sexual acts, again, while having UTIs, while on their menstrual cycle. Those types of things might also fall under coercion. But again, Jesse, I think the jury will have to realize that too. Like, okay, they've heard a lot of instances as it pertains to Cassie with violence and things of that sort. But in terms of Jane, I don't think the force is necessarily all there, because they kind of point to one specific instance of physical assault, and that being what had happened on June 18th, June 19th of 2024. So just last year. But it'll be interesting to see what the jury has to say in terms of counts 2 and 4, that again being sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, as it pertains to Jane and Cassie Ventura Fine. So it'll be interesting to see what they think about this too, because we may think one way, but the jury may think a completely different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought this was interesting too. There are other parts. We're not going through all of the jury instructions, but the testimony. I thought this was interesting. It says in the jury instructions that the testimony of a witness who has been granted immunity should be examined by you with greater care than the testimony of an ordinary witness. You should examine the testimony of such a witness to determine whether or not it is colored in any way to further the witness's own interests. Now, you and I both know a lot of important witnesses testified under immunity. They were going to plead the fifth, right against self-incrimination, but they were granted protection from prosecution. Who stands out to you?
I think who stands out to me most is probably Brendan Paul, and I would say Bonna stand out to me most, and for just completely different reasons. Now, we've heard a lot about Brendan Paul even prior to trial because of the Rodney Jones lawsuit and how he was named in that particular lawsuit as an alleged drug mule. He gets on the stand and he is adamant that he is not an alleged drug mule. He is nothing of that sort. He says, according to him, that he was kind of on the straight and narrow for the most part until that arrest had happened. He was a basketball player previously. He just wanted to do music. He had been working for Sean Combs to kind of, work his way up, those types of things. So he kind of stood out to me because, as we all remember, he was arrested at the airport over in Florida at the same time that Sean Combs's homes were being raided, because he had, according to his testimony, he had a small amount of cocaine on his person that he was supposed to transfer into, I think, either the Gucci bag or one of the designer named bags that was supposed to go with Sean Combs before this trip, this family trip that they were all going on. And then he ends up getting caught with it. He's arrested, but he ended up having a really great lawyer, as he had said, while he had testified, and he was able to kind of work a deal out. And so that's all good. And so even in terms of Bonna's testimony, I think the jury might have a lot of questions in their mind about her and her credibility in a certain way, because there was this whole issue on whether or not this alleged balcony incident happened, but more importantly, when the date of this alleged incident even occurred, because according to the defense, Sean Combs wasn't even in California on the date that Bonna had alleged that he had dangled her from a 17-story balcony over at Cassie's condo. And so I think these are just some questions that will be going through the jurors' minds while they're back there deliberating. Now, whether or not they may remember every single one of the immunized witnesses, that is a wait and see, because there were a little bit of them. I can name, George Kaplan, I can name David James, there is Brendan Paul, there was Bonna Bongolan. And so those are just some of the immunized witnesses that just come to my mind. And I think all of their testimony was interesting, but definitely Brendan's and Bonna's stood out to me the most.
Oh, yeah. I have to ask you about this. It was really interesting. Apparently, they say this in the jury instructions. Diddy's voluntary, not Diddy, don't say, but Diddy's voluntary intoxication or drunkenness can be considered by the jury as a way to negate his intent to commit certain crimes. So racketeering conspiracy, attempt, kidnapping, bribery, forced labor. I mean, do you remember when that was discussed during the trial? Did Mark Agnifilo mention that in his closing argument? That feels significant because during the course of the trial, the defense was keen on talking about his substance abuse problems. But the idea that this negates an element of the charges. Did Agnifilo mention anything like this?
I feel like I can't remember right off the top of my head whether or not he did, but I think there were points that they definitely, on the defensive side, were really trying to sprinkle in that it might have either been a drunken night or a bad batch of drugs that really caused the reactions that maybe Sean Combs allegedly had on certain instances. I go back to the March 2016 incident where I think the defense was trying to kind of poke holes in terms of just what had happened that night, what had caused that particular violent encounter to really happen. And they, I think at points were trying to say it was, a bad night of drinking or as a bad batch of drugs. And I think it was interesting that the judge did read that particular instruction, because I think on the government side, I think they were trying to point to different instances where Sean Combs may have just been completely not drunk or anything like that when violent episodes had occurred. And I think they were trying to say things like when it happened or what had happened on June 18th, June 19th of 2024, where they were kind of trying to drive the point that Sean Combs and Jane both had the same amount to drink. But however, we know what had happened at that particular instance. They both got into a physical altercation. Jane initially kind of slammed Sean Combs' head into a counter, and then Sean Combs reacted in a very, very violent manner where he was chasing Jane throughout her apartment. He kicked her, he dragged her, he caused visible injuries to her that only the jury could see from the exhibit photos and things of that sort. And so it's interesting.
I just want to say, just because he probably was in love with Cassie, that don't mean that he should hit her like that. And I feel like, if anything, for him beating her, he at least should get charged with that if he walk away. You know what I'm saying? If anything, he need to get charged with beating her. That is not acceptable at all.
Whether or not the jury will really kind of take into account that particular instruction. Obviously, they should take into account all the instructions that the judge gave them. But that particular instruction kind of stood out to me because I wonder how much of the testimony do they remember, and do they think, okay, well, maybe is it possible that it was just drugs or alcohol or somebody under the influence that caused some of these instances to happen?
Like I said, a lot for this jury to consider, and why I am not surprised that they didn't come back with a verdict today. I could have guessed that. I would have put any money on that they wouldn't have come back with a verdict today. Do they come back with a verdict before the July 4th weekend? That's a more difficult question. We'll see. A lot of evidence, a lot of testimony, a lot of charges, a lot of elements, a lot of law. Elizabeth Millner, thank you so much. Great seeing you.
Thanks, Jesse.
And that is all we have for you right now here on Sidebar. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. And as always,
yeah, I feel like, man, the game code and the same people that's judging him, live that type of lifestyle behind closed doors. He's a billionaire, and them girls, they know what they got into. You got into a relationship with he let y'all, like, y'all already know that he got an open relationship and how he lived, not beating on people and stuff like that. That's not acceptable. But yeah, as far as burning up Kid Cudi car and stuff like that, people in relationships get into it, and men fight other men and girls fight other girls. That happens all the time. Same people behind closed doors, as freaky as him, and live that same type of lifestyle, So, yeah, it's a cold game. I don't know. Leave y'all thoughts in the comments. Let me know what y'all think. Y'all think he gonna get charged with? How y'all think it's gonna go? Y'all think he gonna get charged with the racketeering? Y'all think he gonna get charged with sex trafficking? Y'all thoughts in the comments. I'm out of here.